Holly Walker.
Mr Speaker, may I take this opportunity first of all to congratulate you and your fellow presiding officers, as this is the first time I've risen to speak on a bill in this House. I look forward to you holding us all to the very high standards expected of us by the New Zealand public. It's a great pleasure, Mr Speaker, to take my first call on a piece of legislation for the Hutt Valley, since that is my home and where I grew up and where I stood as a candidate in the recent election. I've had very productive conversations already with the Honourable Trevor Mallard, who's sponsoring this bill, and with the Mayor of Lower Hutt, Ray Wallace, and I'm confident that we can work constructively together to advance this legislation. Mr Speaker, the Greens broadly support this bill and will be supporting it to Select Committee. However, that support is not guaranteed past that stage, as there are a number of issues we'd like to see teased out at the Select Committee, and a number of those have been referred to already. Mr Speaker, we do acknowledge that graffiti is problematic, and particularly tagging is problematic, and in parts of Lower Hutt, and particularly abandoned buildings, that's a real problem. We've heard that it's especially a problem on empty and abandoned buildings where the property owners may not have the willingness or the inclination to do anything about cleaning it up. It's detrimental to residents' perception of social cohesion in their neighbourhoods. It feeds concerns about safety and discourages community engagement. And as we've heard, a number of residents have identified it as an issue that they feel is of concern. And we do know that swift removal of graffiti is the best way to discourage further, for example, competitive tagging, where a building's been tagged and other taggers come to add their tag as well. However, when the House last considered local legislation to tackle graffiti, which was the very problematic Manukau City Council Control of Graffiti Bill, we found ourselves, the Green Party found ourselves unable to support that legislation. It was very draconian. It had a much wider reach than this particular bill, and provisions which we felt really scapegoated young people and were quite unacceptable. So I'm pleased that this bill is not modelled on that more extensive bill. There were some provisions in that bill. In fact, my former colleague Nandor Tantros, I had a look at the Hansard, spoke in favour of the parts of that bill which do what this bill does, which is allow council officers or council contractors onto private property for the purposes of cleaning up graffiti when the owners are unwilling or unable to do so themselves. And so those are the types of provisions that the Green Party is happy to support in legislation dealing with graffiti removal. However, as I've mentioned, we do have problems with wider, more draconian legislation, and I'm very pleased that that's not the case with this legislation. We do have, as has been alluded to already, a number of concerns that we hope will be addressed at the Select Committee stage. And our support is conditional on those being addressed. Now, one we've heard is about the definition of graffiti, which is something I raised with Trevor Mallard and with the Mayor earlier when the legislation was tabled. I do think it's important that it be defined. So, for example, the Manukau legislation I referred to earlier defines marking graffiti as defacing property in any way, whereas dictionary definition of graffiti is writings or drawings scribbled, scratched or sprayed illicitly on a wall or other surface in a public place. Now, there's quite a big difference between those two definitions, and I think it is important to be clear so that types of expression aren't captured that are not intended. I think it's good lawmaking, Mr Speaker, to ensure that the terms that are crucial to the legislation are clearly defined, and I think it's very important that that is teased out at the Select Committee. For example, we want to make sure that legitimate forms of political and artistic expression, like the mural referred to earlier, or for a property owner perhaps to display something on their fence that may make a political point or draw on graffiti art techniques, is not considered graffiti for the purposes of this Act and removed by the Council. I'd also like to echo the concerns raised by the previous speaker about the protection from civil liability for council staff when they enter property to clean graffiti off. for example, if they were to accidentally drive their truck into the fence of the property owner, they would not be liable for the damages caused, and I think that's unacceptable. So I'd like to see that explored further. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I just want to acknowledge that there are forms of graffiti art that are legitimate forms of expression, and it's very important that in the discussion of this legislation we don't forget that. Thank you.
Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's excellent that we